545. That is the number of Irish-born and Irish-descended soldiers who were killed, wounded, or left bleeding on a frozen Virginia hillside on December 13, 1862, in a battle that lasted, for them, less than 1 hour. They had survived the Great Famine. They had survived coffin ships. They had survived the slums of 5 Points and the hatred of the know-nothings. And on that December afternoon, with sprigs of green boxwood tucked into their caps because their real flags were too shattered to carry, they marched uphill into a wall of lead for a country that had barely agreed to let them in. To understand how 1,200 Irishmen came to charge a fortified stone wall on a hill outside Fredericksburg, Virginia, you have to go back 15 years and 4,000 miles to an island where 1 million people were starving to death, while ships loaded with wheat, oats, and cattle sailed out of Irish ports under armed British escort. The Great Famine did not simply kill, it expelled. Between 1845 and 1852, over 1 million Irish men, women, and children crossed the Atlantic in vessels so overcrowded and disease-ridden that they earned a name no shipping company wanted on its ledger: coffin ships. Thousands died at sea. Thousands more died at quarantine stations like Grosse Ile in Canada, where mass graves still mark the ground. The ones who made it to New York Harbor were considered the lucky ones, though luck is a strange word for people who arrived with nothing: no money, no English in many cases, no connections, and no welcome. The Irish who poured into American cities in the late 1840s and 1850s were met with a hostility that would shape everything that followed. Signs reading, "No Irish need apply," hung in shop windows. The Know Nothing movement, formerly organized as the American Party, built its entire platform on the idea that Catholic Irish immigrants were a threat to the Republic. Cartoons in Harper's Weekly depicted the Irish as subhuman, ape-like, drunken, violent. In the tenements of Lower Manhattan, Irish families packed 8 and 10 to a room in buildings with no ventilation and no sanitation. They dug canals. They laid railroad tracks. They took the jobs no one else wanted, at wages no one else would accept. And they buried their dead in unmarked plots in potters' fields across the eastern seaboard. It was in this world, a world of grinding poverty, social contempt, and stubborn survival, that a man named Thomas Francis Meagher saw something no one else seemed willing to see: an opportunity. Meagher was not a typical immigrant. Born in Waterford, Ireland, in 1823, he came from a prosperous Catholic family. His father had served as mayor. Educated at Clongowes Wood College, and later at Stonyhurst in England, Meagher was a brilliant orator who became one of the leading voices of the Young Ireland movement. In 1848, at the height of the famine, he participated in a rebellion against British rule. It failed. He was arrested, tried for sedition, and sentenced to death. The sentence was commuted to transportation for life, exile to Van Diemen's Land, the British penal colony at the far end of the earth, present-day Tasmania. But Meagher was not a man who accepted fate quietly. In 1852, he escaped. He made his way to New York City, where the Irish community received him as a hero, a living symbol of resistance, a man the British Empire had tried to bury and failed. When the Civil War broke out in April 1861, Meagher understood something that most Americans did not. He understood that for the Irish, this war was not simply about preserving the Union or ending slavery. It was about proving, with the only currency America seemed to respect, that the Irish belonged. If Irish soldiers fought and bled and died under the Stars and Stripes, no one could ever again call them foreigners. No one could ever again deny them citizenship in the fullest sense. And there was a second purpose, one that Meagher spoke about only in certain circles. The men who learned to fight in American battlefields would one day carry that training home. One day, they would use it to free Ireland. In September 1861, the formation of an Irish Brigade was authorized by the Secretary of War. The corps was the 69th New York Infantry, a regiment that had already fought at the First Battle of Bull Run, where it was one of the few Union units to maintain cohesion during the chaotic retreat. The 69th had been organized in 1849, composed almost entirely of famine refugees and their sons. Its previous commander, Colonel Michael Corcoran, had gained fame before the war by refusing to parade the regiment for the visiting Prince of Wales, a deliberate public protest against British policy during the famine. Corcoran was arrested for insubordination. He was facing court-martial when Fort Sumter was fired upon, and the charges were quietly dropped because the Union needed every Irishman it could get. To the 69th, Marye added the 63rd and 88th New York, the latter numbered deliberately after the British 88th Connaught Rangers, a famous Irish unit in the British Army. Later, the 28th Massachusetts and the 116th Pennsylvania joined the brigade, both heavily Irish in composition. Each regiment carried 2 flags, the Stars and Stripes, and a brilliant green banner bearing the golden harp of Ireland with a sunburst above it. The war cry of the brigade was Fáu a Ballagh, an anglicization of the Irish phrase Fag an Bealach, meaning clear the way. These were not abstract soldiers. They were dock workers from the East River wharves, canal diggers from upstate New York, laborers from the construction sites of Boston, men who had arrived in America with nothing and who now carried smoothbore 1842 Springfield muskets, weapons already outdated by the time they were issued, with an effective range of barely 100 yards compared to the 300 yards of the rifled muskets carried by other units. By December 1862, the Irish Brigade had already been through hell. At the Battle of Antietam in September, the bloodiest single day in American history, the brigade had charged the Confederate position at the Sunken Road, later known as Bloody Lane. They fought for 3 hours. They made 5 charges. 8 color bearers were shot down in succession. General Marye had his horse killed beneath him. The brigade suffered 60% casualties. And then, barely 3 months later, they were ordered to do it again. The Battle of Fredericksburg was the brainchild of Major General Ambrose Burnside, who had been appointed commander of the Army of the Potomac just 5 weeks earlier, under intense pressure from President Lincoln to produce a decisive victory. Burnside's plan was to cross the Rappahannock River at Fredericksburg and push south toward the Confederate capital at Richmond. The plan might have worked if speed and surprise had been on his side. They were not. Delays in the arrival of pontoon bridges gave Confederate General Robert E. Lee weeks to position his forces on the high ground west of town, a series of hills known as Mary's Heights. Here, behind a stone wall running along a sunken road at the base of the heights, Lee placed some of his best troops. Above them, on the slopes and crest, Colonel Edward Porter Alexander arranged artillery batteries with overlapping fields of fire that covered every inch of the open ground below. It was, by any military assessment, an impregnable position. On December 13th, 120,000 Union soldiers and 80,000 Confederates faced each other across the fields outside Fredericksburg. It was the largest concentration of troops in any Civil War battle to that point. Beginning in the late morning, Burnside ordered brigade after brigade to attack Mary's Heights. One after another, they crossed the open ground. One after another, they were cut to pieces. 4 separate assaults had already failed, with thousands of Union soldiers lying dead and wounded on the frozen slope, when the Irish Brigade received its orders. It was approximately 12:30 in the afternoon. The 5 regiments of the Irish Brigade were formed up along the banks of the Rappahannock, listening to the sound of the battle raging ahead of them. They had watched the first waves go up the hill. They had seen what happened. One soldier turned to his chaplain, Father William Corby, and said what many of them were thinking. "Father," he said, "they are going to lead us over in front of those guns which we have seen placing unhindered, for the past 3 weeks. It was at this moment that General Meagher did something that would become one of the most remembered gestures of the entire war. The brigade's green flags, the emerald banners with the golden harp, were not with them. They had been so badly damaged at Antietam and in earlier campaigns that Meagher had sent them back to New York for repair. The replacements had not yet arrived. So Meagher and several of his staff officers disappeared into the neighborhoods surrounding the docks where the brigade was positioned. They returned carrying armfuls of boxwood, a green, leafy, evergreen shrub. Meagher ordered that every man in the brigade place a sprig of boxwood in his cap. The greenery, he told them, would remind them of their Irish heritage. It was the closest thing to a shamrock they could find on a December day in Virginia. Then Meagher addressed each regiment. He did not pretend the situation was anything other than what it was. "This may be my last speech to you," he told one unit, "but I will be with you when the battle is the fiercest, and if I fall, I can say I did my duty and fell fighting in the most glorious of causes." The brigade responded with 3 cheers. Then they stepped off. The column turned up George Street and headed through the town toward the ridge. As they crested the high ground at the western edge of Fredericksburg, Confederate artillery opened on them with renewed violence. Shells exploded overhead. Solid shot ricocheted off buildings and knocked soldiers from the ranks. One shell exploded in the midst of the 88th New York, injuring 18 men in a single detonation. The brigade broke into a trot. They crossed a muddy canal on the outskirts of town. And then they began the charge. Ahead of them lay 400 yards of open ground, rising gently toward the stone wall. The ground was already carpeted with the dead and wounded from the 4 previous assaults. The Irish advanced at the double quick, muskets at the right shoulder shift, stepping over and around the shattered remnants of the brigades that had preceded them. The 28th Massachusetts was in the center, the only regiment still carrying a green flag, the emerald banner of Ireland snapping in the winter wind. It was this flag that the Confederates behind the wall saw coming. Behind that stone wall stood the brigade of Brigadier General Thomas Cobb, which included the 24th Georgia Infantry. The regiment was commanded by Colonel Robert McMillan, who had been born in County Antrim, Ireland, in 1805, making him, at 57, one of the oldest regimental commanders in either army. McMillan had emigrated to Georgia decades before the war, where he worked as a merchant and served as a state senator. His own son served as the regiment's major. When McMillan saw the green flag of the 28th Massachusetts approaching through the smoke, he knew exactly who was coming. According to the Athens, Georgia newspaper The Southern Watchman, McMillan drew his sword and called out to his men, "That's Meagher's brigade. Give it to them now, boys." There is a story, repeated in countless accounts and popularized by the film Gods and Generals, that the 24th Georgia was itself an Irish regiment, that Fredericksburg was a tragedy of Irish killing Irish on both sides of the wall. The truth, as documented by historians David Gleason and Kelly O'Grady, is more complicated. McMillan was Irish. His son was Irish. The company named in his honor, Company K, the McMillan Guards, was, despite its name, composed almost entirely of Americans from the mountainous regions of North Georgia, where very few Irish had ever settled. In all of Cobb's brigade, only one company was genuinely Irish, the Lochrain Guards of Philip's Legion, from Macon, Georgia. And that company was not even in the 24th Georgia. The myth of a symmetrical Irish tragedy, regiment against regiment, green flag against green flag, is powerful, but the documentary record does not support it. What the record does support is something arguably more painful, that the men behind the wall were mostly Americans who had no particular feeling about the Irishness of the men they were killing. One Confederate who spotted the green banner did, however, call out something that has echoed through 160 years of memory. according to Major Saint. Claire Mulholland of the 116th Pennsylvania, a defender behind the wall, cried, "Oh God, what a pity! Here comes Meagher's fellows." Whether or not those exact words were spoken, Mulholland was on the attacking side and could not have heard them personally. The sentiment captures something real: admiration for the courage of men you are about to destroy. The Irish Brigade advanced to within 30 yards of the stone wall. 30 yards. In modern terms, that is roughly the distance from home plate to first base on a baseball diamond. At that range, the concentrated musket fire from Confederate infantry 4 and 5 ranks deep was unsurvivable. The Confederates were reloading in relays. As soldiers at the wall fired, 2 or 3 men behind them passed loaded muskets forward, creating a continuous, devastating rate of fire. According to Confederate General Joseph Kershaw's official report, the fire from the troops behind the wall was the most rapid and continuous I have ever witnessed. The advance stalled. It could not go forward. The Irish regiments either lay down on the frozen ground or stumbled backward, returning fire as best they could with their 100-yard smoothbore muskets against enemies sheltered behind stone. They lay there, exposed, for the rest of the afternoon, pinned down as subsequent Union brigades attempted the same futile assault behind them. Brigade after brigade came up the slope. Brigade after brigade was destroyed. In 5 hours, 7,000 Union soldiers fell at Mary's Heights alone. Confederate losses defending it were 1,700. Among the Irish wounded was Private William McCarter of the 116th Pennsylvania, a 21-year-old immigrant who had impressed Meagher with his handwriting and been assigned as a clerk to brigade headquarters. But clerks charged with soldiers at Fredericksburg. McCarter later documented his wounds with the precision of a man determined to remember every detail. One spent ball struck him on the left shoulder, leaving a large bruise. Another clipped his ankle. A Marye ball pierced his cartridge box. Others cut through his uniform. He finally collapsed when a bullet tore through his arm. He fell where he stood and used the body of a dead comrade as cover against the Confederate fire until darkness fell and he could crawl to safety. McCarter survived. He wrote a memoir titled My Life in the Irish Brigade, one of the most vivid first-hand accounts of combat in the entire Civil War. After nightfall, the survivors staggered or were carried back to Fredericksburg. The next morning, just 230 men of the Irish Brigade answered roll call. Several hundred others would straggle in during the course of the day, but the damage was beyond anything the brigade had experienced, and the Irish Brigade had already experienced Antietam. In the final count, 545 men were killed, wounded, or missing. 45% of the men who had marched up that hill. 14 of 15 field officers were hit. The only officer above the rank of captain to escape unharmed was Colonel Patrick Kelly of the 88th New York, who narrowly avoided death when a bullet pierced his coat just below his spine. Captain William J. Nagle of the Irish Brigade wrote to his father in a letter that was reprinted in the Irish American newspaper on December 27, 1862. His words carried the weight of a man who had seen something he knew the world would try to forget. "Oh, it was a terrible day," he wrote. "The destruction of life has been fearful, and nothing gained. Irish blood and Irish bones cover that terrible field today. We are slaughtered like sheep, and no result but defeat." Father Corby, the brigade's chaplain, was more direct in his memoirs. The place into which Meagher's brigade was sent, he wrote, was simply a slaughter pen with absolutely no protection for our ranks. Needless to say, our brigade was cut to pieces. The Confederate officers who watched the charge unfold were stunned by what they saw. Lieutenant General James Longstreet, whose corps had defended Mary's Heights, later called the charge of the Irish Brigade the handsomest thing in the whole war. General Robert E. Lee himself reportedly said, "Never were men so brave." and Brigadier General George Pickett, who within 7 months would lead his own legendary and disastrous charge at Gettysburg, wrote to his wife about the Irish assault in terms that crossed from military respect into something closer to awe. "Your soldier's heart almost stood still," Pickett wrote, as he watched these sons of Erin fearlessly rush to their death. "The brilliant assault on Mary's heights of their Irish Brigade was beyond description. Why, my darling, we forgot they were fighting us, and cheer after cheer at their fearlessness went up all along our lines." This is the part that history records with admiration. What history records less well is what happened next. After Fredericksburg, the Irish Brigade was a shattered remnant. Meagher immediately requested permission to return to New York to recruit replacements, to rebuild the brigade that had proven its value in the most devastating way possible. The request was denied. The Union Army, which had been willing to spend 545 Irish lives in a single afternoon, would not authorize the recruitment of replacements. Meagher requested again after the Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863, where the already depleted brigade took further casualties. He was denied again. In the Irish neighborhoods of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, the denial landed like a second blow. According to research documented by emerging Civil War historian Sean Brennan, the losses at Fredericksburg created overwhelming disillusionment among New York's Irish community. The suspicion that had always lurked beneath the surface that the Union treated Irish soldiers as expendable, that nativist commanders did not mind squandering Irish lives, now hardened into conviction. On May 14, 1863, Thomas Francis Meagher resigned his commission. He did not resign because he lacked courage. He did not resign because he had lost faith in the cause. He resigned because the brigade he had built from famine refugees and dock workers no longer existed except in name, and the government he had served would not let him rebuild it. According to Fox's Regimental losses, of all Union Army brigades in the Civil War, only the 1st Vermont Brigade and the Iron Brigade suffered more combat dead than the Irish Brigade. The Irish had given everything, and the answer from Washington was, "It is enough. You are not worth replacing." Meagher's resignation did not hold permanently. The Army rescinded it in December 1863 and reassigned him to the Western Theater, where he spent the remaining years of the war in less consequential commands. After the war, he was appointed acting governor of Montana Territory, a turbulent posting where he made enemies among both Republicans and vigilantes. On July 1st, 1867, Thomas Francis Meagher fell from a steamboat on the Missouri River at Fort Benton, Montana, and drowned. He was 43 years old. The circumstances of his death have never been fully explained. Historians have proposed accident, illness, intoxication, and murder. His body was never recovered. The men of the Color Guard of the 69th New York, after the battle, could not find their national flag, the stars and stripes they had carried up the hill. They feared it had been captured, which would have been a dishonor worse than death for any Civil War regiment. A search party went back onto the field. They found the color sergeant propped against a tree, the empty flagstaff beside him. He had been shot through the heart. When they searched his body, they found the flag wrapped around his torso, hidden beneath his coat. He had used his dying moments to protect it from capture, the flag of a country that had barely agreed to let him in. The Irish Brigade was rebuilt, slowly, with recovered wounded and new recruits, many of them fresh off the boat, lured by enlistment bounties that seemed like fortunes to men who had just crossed the Atlantic. By Gettysburg in July 1863, the brigade could field roughly 600 men, barely a single regiment's worth, spread across 5 regimental designations. They fought in the wheat field. They took more casualties. They fought in the wilderness, at Spotsylvania, at Cold Harbor, at Petersburg. The brigade survived the war, But the Irish Brigade that charged Mary's Heights, the 1,200 dockworkers and canal diggers and famine survivors who followed a Waterford revolutionary into a slaughter pen with boxwood in their caps. That brigade died on December 13th, 1862. There is one more detail that belongs in this story, and it connects Fredericksburg to something that happened a century later. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy, the great-grandson of famine immigrants from County Wexford, visited Ireland. During that visit, he presented a set of the Irish Brigade's battle flags to the Oireachtas, the Irish Parliament. Those flags now hang in Leinster House in Dublin, in the chamber where Irish legislators make the laws of a free republic. They are tattered. They are faded. They are the same green banners that were too damaged to carry at Fredericksburg, the reason 1,200 Irishmen went into battle with nothing but boxwood to mark who they were. Every year, thousands of visitors walk the grounds at Fredericksburg battlefield. They stand behind the stone wall. They look down the slope toward the town. At the city dock, where the Irish Brigade bivouacked before the battle, a monument now stands. At the Fredericksburg Battlefield Visitor Center, behind glass, sits the drum of the 28th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, the regiment that carried the last green flag up the hill, the drum that once beat the advance for men who knew they were marching to their deaths. It was found in a Boston office building in 1991, more than a century after it last sounded on a Virginia hillside. 545 casualties in less than an hour, 14 of 15 officers hit. A color sergeant who wrapped the flag around his body before he died. A general who resigned because the country he fought for refused to let him rebuild what it had destroyed. And 1,200 men, immigrants, refugees, survivors of one of the worst famines in modern history, who charged a stone wall with green leaves in their caps because it was all they had left of who they were. They did not clear the way, but they did not forget it either.